the purpose of which is to go attract these little things, these little biological Pac-Men that are floating in your blood. These biological Pac-Men are called macrophages. And macrophages are there to eat the unwanted cellular material that's not supposed to be there. Okay, these are literally biological Pac-Men, and they come to the site, and just like you get in the video game, they're sort of coming and they're like gobble, 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 gobble. What can I eat? What can I eat? What can I eat? And they find that all of this excess material, and they just start to endocytose it and suck it up and just clear the area so that they can return the adipose tissue to a much more anti-inflammatory mode. So in order to do that, this is called macrophage infiltration, because the macrophages are literally recruited to the site of inflammation, and then they penetrate the tissue to get to this material to start gobbling it up. And the problem that this creates is that as soon as the tissue goes into this distress state, now it starts to block the amount of fatty acids that come inside of it, because the more fatty acids the tissue accepts, the more of this problem is going to happen. So the tissue goes in this mode where it's like, hold on. Stop, like, give me the macrophages, get them over here, start gobbling up this material, and stop importing fat. I do not want fat right now. And so it blocks, that creates a traffic jam again, and it blocks free fatty acid uptake. And that means that fatty acids begin to pool inside of your blood where they don't want to be. And then as a result of that, they end up trying to release a lot of fatty acids that are stored in order to relieve some of the pressure that's built up inside of this tissue. So they literally start leaking fatty acids into the blood. And as a result of that, now the blood is accumulating fatty acids once again. So in effect, this tissue is basically saying, hold on, I'm literally breaking. So get the macrophages over here to fix this stuff. And then I'm just going to start to offload some of this material so that I don't break more. And in this process, that causes your fatty acid concentration inside your blood to go up, which is not awesome, because this is, again, hyperlipidemia, which means excess fat inside of your blood transiently. And then when that happens, now, well, where's the lipids going to go? The lipid says, well, I can't get inside the adipose tissue because it just kicked me out. Now I got to go somewhere else. And so it ends up moving towards your muscle and towards your liver and towards your pancreas. And then it starts the same cycle that you saw on the previous slides. More fatty acids, boom, right into the muscle, right into the liver, exacerbates insulin resistance in those two tissues. Now those two tissues are even more, they're more forced to take up free fatty acids, even though they don't necessarily want it. And as a result of that, it accelerates and it increases the magnitude of insulin resistance inside of both tissues. Okay. Now, here's the final thing which can happen. There's the beta cells. These are very specific cells inside of your pancreas, which are responsible for secreting insulin. They're the only cell type in your entire body that can manufacture insulin. Okay. So when something happens to your beta cell population, if that population gets compromised in any way, shape, or form, you run into a system-wide defect. Okay, this is called diabetes. This is called diabetes that causes your blood glucose to go very high, and it can cause a significant number of metabolic consequences down the road. So, in other words, your beta cells are extremely important in overall glucose metabolism, in overall metabolic health, and so it's to your advantage to be very protective of the beta cell population inside of your liver. I'm sorry, inside of your pancreas. Now, beta cells make up about maybe 1% of your total pancreas. Okay, very small percentage. And what can happen is that there's a problem called lipotoxicity. Lipotoxicity refers to an excess lipid presentation or an excess lipid load inside of beta cells that happens mainly in obese people. And when that happens, that can actually cripple the ability of beta cells to manufacture and secrete insulin, and it can cause them to commit suicide. Okay, so here's how that happens. Okay, inside of your beta cells, there is a very, very sophisticated and highly active network of what are called mitochondria. Mitochondria are present in every cell in your body, and these mitochondria have a wide array of functions. Okay, their main function is to import that. You can think of them as like energy factories. They import fuel. They run the fuel through this thing called the electron transport chain, and then that increases ATP generation. So they basically suck fuel in, and then they kick out energy. Okay, so it's like, I don't know, you can think of it as like a solar panel, right? It sucks in sunlight, right? It's exposed to UV radiation, and then it kicks out electricity. It's the same thing. You give it fuel, and then you end up creating energy, right? So these are These are small little energy factories, and they happen to be very, very, very abundant inside of beta cells because they have a very specific function. And their function is to basically help in the production of insulin. It's a very complex system, and we don't need to go into too much detail about that. But what I do want you to focus on is that when there's a lot of fatty acids that are being presented to the beta cells, because there's a high concentration of fat inside of your blood, then these fatty acids can annoy these mitochondria. And so these mitochondria produce ATP. They take the fatty acids and they go, okay, great, now I'm going to go make some ATP. So they do. But in the process of making ATP, they also make this stuff called free radicals, which are called reactive oxygen species. And free radicals are really dangerous molecules. Okay, you can think of this as like unwanted byproduct. It's a waste. It's a waste material. And the production of free radicals increases as the flux or the amount of fatty acids that goes through the mitochondrial network increases. So when this happens, these mitochondria generate a significant amount of these free radicals, reactive oxygen species, and these guys are basically highly unstable molecules. And what they do is they can go and they can attach to DNA, okay, and they can actually cause direct DNA damage, whether that's in the nucleus or whether it's in the mitochondria. Neither one of them is a good scenario, because anytime you alter DNA, you are going straight to the central computer, and you are jeopardizing the health of the cell as a whole. Okay, so it interacts with DNA, and it can cause DNA single strand breaks, and it causes DNA double strand breaks. Both of them are extremely dangerous. Number two, these reactive oxygen species can also go affect and attach to proteins. And when they do, they cause protein oxidation, which is otherwise called oxidative stress. And this can help age a cell faster than it's supposed to age. And this can help the cell get to a point where it says, you know what, this is too dangerous. I'm going to commit suicide. So it accelerates the protein oxidation process. And then in addition to that, it also can cause damage to lipids. And this process is called lipid peroxidation. So we have DNA damage, we have protein oxidation, and we have lipid peroxidation. The combination of the three of those makes it so that a normal islet that you see on the left-hand side, which is normal size, manufacturing a normal amount of insulin, all of a sudden becomes hyperplastic because now it's starting to secrete excess insulin because it had to, because it was forced to, because there's too much insulin resistance inside of your liver and muscle. So now it's a larger cell that's ramping up its production, and it's basically working in overdrive to make more insulin, more insulin, more insulin, more insulin. And in the same time, it's exposed to saturated fatty acids. And as a result of that, at a certain point, the cell just becomes tired. The mitochondrial network says, I'm producing way too many reactive oxygen species. This is not going to work. The cell itself is like, I'm producing way too much insulin. I cannot do this in an infinite time period. I can't do this anymore. And then the beta cell commits what's called programmed cell death, otherwise known as apoptosis. And so when that occurs, the cell basically goes into a self-defense mode, and it basically stops insulin production. And then it triggers a whole collection of biological processes that says, kill me now. I'm going to try and protect the rest of this beta cell population. And I'm not going to basically like compromise their function. Get rid of me. My time is over. And then boom, the cell literally commits suicide. Macrophages come in, clear it out, and it's done. And it will not replace itself. So this is a one-way path towards a reduced beta cell population. So this is what the lipotoxicity pathway can create. Again, it happens mainly in people who are living with obesity, but this is another example of how lipids can negatively impact your liver and your muscle and your adipose tissue and the beta cells inside of your pancreas, all four of which have to work together in order to allow this glucose metabolism to work properly, and all four of which are negatively impacted by the presence of that one molecule of the saturated fat. Okay. Now, I told you earlier that I have autoimmune diabetes. And what that means is that I have an autoimmune version of diabetes, which means that I cannot secrete insulin. And as a result of that, I have to inject insulin from the outside world. Now, insulin resistance is canonically thought of as basically being a condition that only affects people who are overweight and people who are sedentary. And that leads to both prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. But what people who are living with type 1 diabetes don't recognize, and doctors who treat people with type 1 diabetes don't recognize, that you can actually be living with both type 1 and the symptomology of type 2 diabetes simultaneously. And this is fascinating because this is what happened to me at the beginning of this process. I have autoimmune diabetes, which means that there's immune cells which are basically going and crippling and killing the beta cell population. You don't have a choice. They come in, they clear out the beta cell population, and they're done. And so as a result of that, I can't manufacture insulin. So autoimmune diabetes basically just kills these cells before you even know it. And as a result of that, now you have a compromised beta cell population. If you add into that insulin resistance, which is the saturated fat accumulation that causes lipid accumulation inside of your liver and your muscle and your adipose tissue, this can then cause, so this means that you are now living with double diabetes, which again is the presence of type 1 diabetes, autoimmune diabetes, and the symptomology of type 2 diabetes, which means that your liver is negatively impacted, your muscles negatively impacted, and your adipose tissue is negatively impacted. So those three tissues, which normally become impacted by a saturated fat intake, are still getting impacted by a saturated fat intake, but your pancreas is already getting crippled by the autoimmune attack. And now you got two huge problems, and both of them compound upon one another. So effectively, what can happen in this scenario is that if you're already living with autoimmune diabetes and you choose to eat a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, which tends to be very high in saturated fat by design, then what you are likely to see, okay, so this is sort of where people get confused. And this is where I will fully admit that the story that I'm telling you right now can become confusing, because if you go and look online and you go talk to people who are eating a low carbohydrate diet, they're going to be like, everything that you just heard from that guy named Cyrus online, like, what is he talking about? Like, I didn't experience any of that. Like, that's not true, right? I don't care what the research says. I switched over to eating a low carbohydrate diet, and guess what happened? My blood glucose came down. My A1C came down. Guess what? I lost a ton of weight. Yeah, I lost, 25 pounds. I lost 30 pounds. I feel better than ever before. My cholesterol came down. My triglycerides came down. My blood pressure came down. What is the problem? I don't understand. All I do is I eat more meat and more dairy products, and I've eliminated carbohydrate, and now I feel like $1 million. Okay. This is exactly what happens to people who eat a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. Okay. But all of those changes unfold in the short term. Short term means 6 months, 12 months, 3 months, somewhere within usually the first year of transitioning to a low carbohydrate diet. All of those things are true. These people are not lying. Okay, maybe you guys have gone through that yourself, or maybe you know somebody who has. What they don't know is that if they literally hit the fast forward button and they go blah, 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 and they go to 5 years in the future, and then they take a look at themselves, then the picture that they're going to see of themselves 5 years from now does not look like the picture of themselves 6 months into the process, because that picture of them 5 years down the road is a lot worse off than they are right now. So you get all these short-term improvements that then become long-term medical liabilities, because the insulin resistance process takes time to unfold. And as your liver begins to accumulate more and more and more and more and more lipid, and as your muscle begins to accumulate more and more and more and more lipid, and as your adipose tissue begins to accumulate more and more and more lipid, then it causes insulin resistance in three very large tissues. Then it can also increase your LDL concentration, which is not good, because that definitely can increase your risk for a future cardiac event, and it can increase your blood pressure simultaneously. It can trigger the atherosclerotic process, which can then harden blood vessels, causing oxidized LDL inside of the actual wall of blood vessels. So what I think the diabetes world suffers from is a fundamental misunderstanding of one variable, which is time. And that even though eating a low carbohydrate diet might give you all of the short-term improvements on the left that you see in the short term, if you add time to that metabolic state and you move forward into the future and you continue eating that same type of diet, then you're likely to develop these longer-term side effects. And these longer-term side effects are things that the research is ripe with. And you see in large-scale studies that follow people over the course of 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, 15 years. If you take these very large data sets and look at free-living humans who are consuming more fat and more protein and less carbohydrate energy from plant material, you will see that there's a significantly increased risk for mortality from cancer, for mortality from cardiovascular disease, and for mortality from diabetes. Okay, so all of these things are there. There's not stories I'm making up. These are all things that are grounded inside of the research. And unfortunately, most people prioritize the short term and sacrifice the long term, and don't realize that they're actually turning themselves into a larger, they're increasing their overall chronic disease risk, but they're unaware of it at the time. So the question really becomes, well, what can you do to solve this problem? If the picture that I presented to you is that Saturated fat in combination with refined carbohydrate is really what's causing this problem, but mainly driven by saturated fat metabolism that affects your liver and your muscle and your adipose tissue and your pancreas in a negative manner. Well, then what do you do? How can you solve this problem? Well, okay. So in order to answer that, all you got to do is take a look at the foods on the screen. Okay. The foods on the screen are specifically designed. There's a lot of things in common. Number one, you see only plant material. Okay. Everything that you see on the screen is a plant or grows on a plant or came from a plant or is the fruit of a plant or grew in the ground as part of a plant. Every single thing on the ground on the screen. Okay. And the foods that you see are also very colorful. They're very antioxidant rich because antioxidants are pigments and they're there to protect the DNA of that actual fruit or vegetable against UV radiation. But those antioxidants are actually really good for you because they help bathe tissues in anti-inflammatory compounds that can help stimulate normal metabolic processes. In addition to that, these foods they're very colorful, they're very tasty, a lot of them are very filling, and they're also extremely high in fiber, and fiber is your friend when it comes to this dietary game. Okay. In addition to that, all the foods that you see on the screen here are low in saturated fat by design. Okay. I told you earlier, the saturated fat is a very problematic component of food. And when you consume a significant amount of saturated fat, you set yourself up for increased chronic disease risk. So if you can envision a world where you transition your diet to eating mainly the foods that you see on the screen here, even if it's not 100%, that's fine. Then you can get to a point where your saturated fat intake used to be high and now it's low. And as a result of being low, you're now undoing the traffic jam that you built up inside of your liver and muscle and adipose tissue and pancreas. Okay. So the foods that we created a traffic light system, green light, yellow light, red light, just to make things as simple as possible. Okay. So the foods in the green light category include fruits, starchy vegetables, which are vegetables that grow on the ground, like potatoes and yams and squashes. Okay. I'm also going to put corn in that category because it acts like a starchy vegetable, even though it's a grain. Okay. And then we have non-starchy vegetables like tomatoes and cucumbers and cauliflower and broccoli and okra and vegetables that generally don't have a starchy consistency. Then you have all legumes, beans, lentils, and peas. You got green leafy vegetables, intact whole grains, which are whole grains that are minimally processed, as well as herbs and spices. So the foods in the green light category are those foods right there. The foods in the green light category you can eat in, I'm going to say, unlimited quantities, unlimited with an asterisk, meaning I'm not suggesting that you go overeat these foods. I'm suggesting that you eat these foods to satiation and then stop, and don't have to worry about calorie counting, and don't have to worry about portion control, and don't have to worry about how much of them you're eating, because the presence of the fiber and the water, what's known as bulk, is actually the single most important component that can talk to your digestive system, that can send a neurological signal to your brain that says, "Oh, slow down, slow down, slow down." Now, what that means is that the foods that are on the left-hand side right here, they contain a significant fiber content and a significant water content. Okay, truth be told, they contain 9 classes of macro and micronutrients. Okay, and those classes include carbohydrate, fat, protein. Okay, those are the macronutrients. That's where you get your energy. Carbohydrate, fat, protein, 1, 2, 3. In addition to that, there's vitamins, minerals, fiber, water, antioxidants, and phytochemicals. I'll say that again: carbohydrate, fat, protein, macronutrients. The micronutrients are vitamins, minerals, fiber, water, antioxidants, and phytochemicals. Okay, these 9 classes of components, or these nine classes of nutrients, are all packaged into one complex 3-dimensional structure. And that 3-dimensional structure either takes a shape as a peach, or a chickpea, or brown rice. Okay, all of those components are inside of every single one of those foods. They just happen to be in slightly different proportions. Fruits might have a slightly higher carbohydrate content than a green pepper, and beans, lentils, and peas might have a slightly higher protein content than a banana. Okay, so think of that all 9 of these components as being present inside of all whole foods. It's just that there's sort of like a slightly different amount of carbohydrate, a little bit of difference in fat, and a little bit of difference in vitamin mineral content and whatnot, but they're all there.